Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about the concept of misfortune. Now, it's an interesting concept in a lot of ways. And I particularly like to bring in, actually, the more ancient concept of the goddess Fortuna. This is analogous. It's the Roman version of the Greek goddess Tyche, from which you get the name Tikhon. Russian Orthodox will know that one. The original one was Saint Tikhon in the 4th century, and that's where you get the anglicization of Tycho from, as in Tycho Brahe. But so the goddess Fortuna was very interesting in the ancient world, because the idea of fortune was itself very significant in the ancient world. The modern world it's still significant, but has spent a lot of effort on trying to tame down fortune, with things like, for example, insurance. And there are other things analogous to insurance that are all about the modern world trying to reduce the variability of life. But no matter whether you're ancient or modern, life is very uncertain. Lots of things are outside of your control. Now, of course, fortune in modern English just doesn't work very well, which is why I like the goddess Fortuna for describing the concept. Can go either way. It can be good fortune or bad fortune. Good fortune being things, outside of your control, but like picking the winning lottery numbers, for example, would be good fortune. But what interests me much more is the concept of misfortune, because it really gets to a very interesting distinction. So I need to build up to it, but we're heading towards a very interesting distinction between a Christian worldview, although, really, Jews would share it too, but I'm Catholic, so, Christian worldview, and more of the pagan worldview. So in misfortune, as Fortuna controls those things that are outside of your control and manipulates them for your success or failure at various things, there are really two types of misfortune. The one type of misfortune is that which has nothing to do with anything you're doing. So, for example, this is the classic, the meteor, strikes your house while you're out at the market, and you've got no house left. And, that has nothing to do with it. You can't meteor-proof your house or anything. In the ancient world, there'd be, diseases, and still in modern times, disease strikes people too. We have the idea that we have a lot of control of diseases, but we only control some of them, really. And our ideas of what control a lot of things like cancer, for example, some things we're kind of right about, some things we're not so right about in terms of what controls them. And the ancient world often had too, and the modern world, depending on where you are in it, armies can just sweep in out of nowhere and, steal your possessions and, kill a large fraction of your family and so on. So the world's full of those things that you simply can't control either way. The other sort of misfortune, this, by the way, is not the distinction we're getting at. It's just important to be systematic as we approach it. The other type of misfortune is that where you did have control over it. And this is, typically speaking, the domain of vice. So, a good example is where, you're used to speeding on a road and there's never a cop, there with a radar. And then, one day finally there was. And, this was, this great misfortune that, I was speeding through and there actually was a cop there. Well, yes, there was an element beyond your control, to be sure. You couldn't control whether or not there was a, policeman there with the radar to catch you speeding. But you shouldn't have been speeding. And there are a lot of similar things that you see. People who cheat on a significant other, and then, it often goes well, but they, confluence of factors happen and they get caught. And, it was such a misfortune because, this shouldn't have happened. Well, yes and no. The relevant portion here, though, is that even though these two things look very distinct, for my purposes, they really aren't, because they both concern looking at misfortune in the same sort of way. And it's really looking at it in it's looking at the world primarily from the world's perspective, which is not the primary perspective from which the world should be looked at. The world should primarily be looked at from God's perspective, because that's the right ordering of things. Now, when you look at the world from the world's perspective, what you tend to find is that there are four classical replacements for God: power, pleasure, wealth, and honor. Thomas Aquinas identified them. Bishop Barron likes to talk about these, and I think for good reason, because usually people will substitute one of these four things for God, sometimes several of these four things for God. But all four of these are, properly speaking, their perception of the goodness of God. And this gets to a distinction that I made before in my manning up video, actually. But it's one of the key distinctions, which is why I want to come back to it. And this is the distinction I really want to make and look at its implications. And that is the distinction between our two purposes. On the one hand, one of our purposes is to appreciate the goodness of God, because God is complete in himself, being the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover, and so on. God is metaphysically speaking simple and complete in himself and perfectly happy, so we don't add anything to God. God created us for our sake, not for his. So he created us that he could give himself to us, that we could, he gives us our being. He is, being itself. And so he fills us up. And so that's one half of our purpose, is to appreciate the goodness of God. And all that we call pleasure and so on, whether physical or intellectual or so on, it's all some form of appreciating the goodness of God, whether it's, physical pleasure, whether it's, something that tastes good, whether it is, the fun of being on a roller coaster, whether it is beauty that you look at. All of these things are appreciating the goodness of God. It's some aspect of the goodness of God. The world's a little bit like a prism that takes, light and separates it out. It's an imperfect analogy, but the world's sort of like that, where each part of the world is reflecting just sort of one aspect of God's goodness, and we appreciate the different ones. That's one of our purposes. The other purpose we have, in the broad brush purposes, is as co-creators. Now, I want to be clear, this is something God gives to us, because all of life is gift. So everything is gift, including being a co-creator. The technical name for being a co-creator, I like to call it delegation, but the technical name is secondary causation. That God is, primarily causes things, but we secondarily cause things. So, to give a simple example, when you give food to somebody who's hungry, you are taking part in the sustenance of this person, their continued existence. You are helping to give them existence. A really, really simple one, actually, is the action of parents, where parents co-create a new person. The two people come together and have sex. Now, bearing in mind that they only exist because God is giving them existence, and they only have the ability to reproduce because God has given that to them and gives it to them in the moment. So they take part in this creative act of making a new person, and so then there is a new person that is made. But I mean, all actions really partake in this. Like teaching somebody something is taking part in the act of creation, of creating that knowledge in that person. As I alluded to before, or mentioned before, rather, feeding a hungry person, clothing the naked. Again, all of these things are taking part in the creation of God. God delegates these things to us, or, we take part by secondary causation. Now, so these are these two purposes. It corresponds to, we can look at the world and focus on one of them, or we can look at both of them. Now, it's fairly rare to focus on the second one, the aspect of co-creation with God. Much more common, and this is what you really see in the ancient world, is that focusing on the receiving of good things. And the thing about this is it's very simple. It's very straightforward. We're all very familiar with this. There are only so many things, by and large, that people tend to actually enjoy. Power, pleasure, wealth, and honor being four of the primary ways in which we receive God's goodness. And there's nothing wrong with any of those four things. They're all good in themselves because they are all appreciating the goodness of God in some form. It's the very fact of their goodness allows us to ignore what they really are and try to take them in place of God. A thing can only be a temptation if it has some goodness in itself. So that's all relatively straightforward. People like tasty food. People enjoy, various types of motion. People enjoy beauty. And there's lots of specifics within beauty and so on. There are lots of different kinds of music. There's lots of different kinds of art. I'm not trying to oversimplify. But at the same time, we have a fairly good grasp of this. We have a fairly good sense of what sorts of things that people enjoy. Because the thing is, this is all passive. This is all receptive. This is the receptive side of our being, where when you are looking at something beautiful, okay, yes, technically the mind, does engage with the thing. And the mind takes on the form of what it perceives and so on. But nonetheless, this is a passive sort of thing where there is the goodness outside and you are perceiving the goodness and therefore, receiving it passively. The other side of it, the co-creative aspect, which is still, part of God's goodness, but it's a different aspect with regard to us. And the co-creative aspect is something that is much, much, much more varied. And it's much more varied because the things that we actually do are specific. They're not general. And so if you think about, what are the things that you actually do, well, there are really a lot of very, very different kinds of things that you do. So, there's clothing the hungry and feeding the naked and so on. These are, sort of broad categories of actions. But at the same time, there's an awful lot of making of things. Like the making of tools actually falls into this sort of category. Because, tools can be pretty, but, by and large, a tool is something, you don't really derive pleasure from it. You don't really look at a tool and get much from it, but nonetheless, it is actually, making a tool is part of creation. Using a tool to make something is part of creation. And there are a lot of things that we make. And moreover, the things that we make, even if we're not very good at perceiving them, are still good and are very varied because they are very particular. So, each day you make food to feed a hungry person, you're making somewhat different food. And if you really think it out, the different, if you make scrambled eggs, well, it's a plate full of stuff that's not all identical to each other. And so you do an action which has a sort of broad effect and makes a lot of things. But where it really gets complicated is that if you don't stop at where it's easy for human beings to foresee the consequences of an action. So, an example I like to use is, what's the effect if I drop this pen? Well, I'm sorry, let go of the pen. Well, it fell. Okay, fine. That's the part that's easy to foresee. What are the other consequences? Well, it did move the air. There's a trivial heating of the air. There's a change in the currents of the air. At some point, that's going to interact with the air outside. Other people will have seen me do this, may take away different things from it. And then where it gets even more complicated is that it is possible that a person will remember that action 20 years down the road and then tell somebody else something because they remembered it. And so the things that we do are actually in multiplicity. Each action is actually a multiplicity of actions, most of which we simply have no concept of. We don't know at all. We don't know what these things are. And the reason that this is significant is that when you look at the things that constitute misfortune, like, say, getting sick, well, getting sick may be an immediate limit, on us, on the things that we could foresee. Like, when I got mono a few months ago, I'm pretty sure, based on symptoms and exposure and so on, was never diagnosed, but I'm pretty sure. And so every day I would crash. I was tired throughout the day and then would just crash at night and couldn't stay awake and couldn't get anything done after my kids were asleep. And, for weeks and weeks I was getting nothing done and getting a little bit done and kind of getting back into the swing of things now. This was a curtailment on what I was able to do of the things that I had planned, which is to say, of the things which I anticipated were going to be given me to do. Things that were going to be given to me to co-create. But my anticipation turned out to have been wrong. Stuff wasn't, things like making videos, for example, during that time wasn't really given to me to do. But I did things during this time. I wasn't, dead. I wasn't suspended animation. And moreover, the things that I did as well as the things that I didn't do, they form patterns which will have effects down through the years. And so there will be things that I am able to do later because of what I did or didn't do, what I did, what I refrained from doing, interactions that I did or didn't have, and so on, I can't possibly foresee. So if I were to look at it in terms of the pleasure side of things, the receptive side of things, there's stuff I wasn't given. And if I were to sort of broaden my horizon just a little bit to take into account the co-creative side just a little bit, There are things that I thought I was going to be given that I wasn't. However, if I don't take my very limited vision to be the sum total of all that actually is, but recognize that there's, most of the world I do not see, I do not know what it is I will be given. And while what it is I will be given to do changed from what I thought it was, it nonetheless is something else. There's still things that I will be given to do. And if I can't anticipate them, well, I'm still going to be given them even if I don't know what they are. And here we come to a very, very different way of looking at misfortune. Because the pagan version, the goddess Fortuna, was very fickle. She could be good to you one moment and turn on you the next. I really recommend the poem O Fortuna, on which the song O Fortuna that Orff wrote. It's from the Carmina Burana, which is a collection of Latin poems in the 7th century. I'm sorry, in the 13th century. And then Orff set it to music in the 1930s. So it's about 700 years in between. But, that's the O Fortuna, that everyone loves, O Fortuna, etc. That one. You've seen it all over in trailers and other stuff. It's really great. I happen to love it. Look up O Fortuna, but like Wikipedia has it. I'll try to remember to link in the description. The text of it is talking about how, you're, oh Fortune, you're changeable. Well, Fortuna, you're so fickle, and you take away health and stuff. It's really impressively pessimistic, actually. I really recommend it. It's kind of interesting to see. Because it does combine a certain sort of realism, but it's realism in a very limited perspective. It's realism if you're thinking only passively, because if you're thinking only of that sort of passively, and only, even if you add in what you get to do, what you're given to do, only what you can foresee of what you get to do, which is the tiniest little drop of what you actually get to do, that is very unpredictable. It's, things can go well one moment and badly another if that little slice of life, if you take that little bit that you actually can perceive and ignore the rest, yeah, that small fraction of what happens is, in fact, very, very unpredictable, and things can go very well for you, then very badly for you, without warning and very quickly. But if you take the broader view of things, if you take not only, what you can foresee, but know that there is a great deal that you can't foresee, but that God is good and will give you things, and will give you a fair amount of co-creation in the world, then misfortune ceases to be nearly so... It ceases to be nearly so fickle, really. And this is, properly speaking, an act of faith. It is taking the knowledge that you have of the goodness of God, and even though you can't see the particulars of it, you know it's there, even though it's not, immediately present to you. And so, I've got a video where I defined faith as knowledge across time. But if you take it, the more classical, the evidence of things unseen, it's a thing to be true but is unseen, the goodness of God, because God sees all the world. One of my favorite metaphors, I'm sorry, not metaphors, just examples, illustrations of this, rather, is if you consider an asteroid orbiting the sun out in the Kuiper Belt, take one well past Pluto. In one of these things so far away from the sun doesn't really look very different from a star, just dark little thing, the dust on the asteroid that no man has ever seen, no man will ever see. When these things so far out, we're just never going to get there. That dust sitting on that asteroid in every moment of time is eternally present to God. It's as eternally present as anything happening in the moment, anything that did happen, anything that will happen. It's all quite eternally present to God. It's not, it's dust on this asteroid, and then, take asteroids, far away in suns that, that orbit suns that have no life around them. They're even further away in places we'll even more so never get to, because there's not even a reason to go there. Yet all these things are eternally present to God too. God sees all of the details in their fullness. And so his plans take into account the fullness of absolutely everything that happens in every detail, in every speck of dust. That the inside of sewers is as eternally present to God as is the inside of a church, as is the top of a mountain, as is the sun, as is a prairie, as is any place at all, because everything is eternally present to God. And so God's gift to us takes into account this fullness. And so the things that we are given are about the fullness of what we were given, not, merely the small fraction that we get to see. And so when you consider things like misfortune, like, when the things that you thought you were going to be given are curtailed, it turns out you weren't given these things that you were anticipating being given. Well, it is logical. In fact, it's, more or less necessarily the case that what you weren't given is, in your misidentification of what you were not given, there are other things that you were given. You'd have to wink out of existence to, not be given other things. And death is a separate category, because in death you cease to be part of the co-creation of the world, except, well, we don't know fully, because, the dead can pray for us and in that way can affect the world. But in any event, in the current sense in which we're given this sort of co-creation, once you die, you're taken out of it. But, we all die, and that's just, there's a finite end to the amount that you're given, because we're all finite creatures. So that's kind of a very different subject. I want to address it just briefly, because I'm not, ignoring it. It's a different subject, and that's just has to do with the finitude of what, finitude of what we've been given. Finiteness. If you don't like the word finitude. But anyway, so just making sure I'm not ignoring that portion. If you don't die, then you're still alive and doing things, and so other co-creation has been given to you. So whatever you anticipated that has not come to pass, there are other things that you've been given. The other thing too is, since actions work their way through time, you build something that 30 years later somebody uses, their benefit that they got is part of your action of having created the thing. Like say, carved, made a tool or carved a piece of furniture or something like that. So even if you die in the interim, the things that you did still carry on through time and are still things that are being given to you. When creation's over and God, I love the metaphor from St. Augustine, when God gathers up the shattered moments of our life. Our lives are shattered across time into all moments that don't really touch each other in any way we understand. And God will gather all these things up at the end of time and put them together into a cohesive whole. So even after you die, the things that you've been given, are still working their way out. Additional things are being given to you even if you're not actively participating in them in that time too. So if you take into account this, if you take into account the big picture, misfortune takes on a radically different perspective, so that the goddess Fortuna really is a pagan goddess, because it consists of not looking at the world in the fullness of what the world is. That's the pagan view of life is really properly understood a limitation. It's not so much that the pagans were wrong. They were wrong about a fair amount, but nonetheless, the big thing is not so much that they were wrong, but that they were very, very limited and very narrow in what they were right about. So they were right about things, but what they were right about was very constricted. And that's why you have the goddess Fortuna, because they focused on only a few things. If you take into account the big picture, if essentially you have faith in God, misfortune takes on a completely different character. It takes on the character not so much of your life has gotten worse, and more the character of a surprise. That it turns out you've been given something that you didn't know you were going to be given, or you didn't anticipate being given. And if you can hold that, it's hard to hold. It's something I try and fail quite a lot. But if you can hold it, it really changes the nature of misfortune. It changes the nature of frustration. And the nice part about this is that it's actually being more accurate. That's the thing. So really, when you look at it correctly, faith in God, it's a virtue, yes, but it also has the benefit of being the rational position, because we are very finite beings. And faith in God, in the way that I'm describing this particular aspect of it, consists essentially of recognizing just how finite we are relative to all of creation. And so taking the fact that we know that God is good, and we know that God is giving to us, by the fact that we're still alive, and yet we don't know what it is. And so faith is recognizing these big things that we do know and not letting the fact that we don't know the particulars get in the way of the clear, unambiguous consequences, logical consequences of God's goodness. And so faith, though it is very difficult, has the benefit of being the only rational position. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.